Hello, and welcome to Tata Literature Live with Shastras. Many of you are regulars, and special thanks to you for joining us again. And I'd like you to spread the word among friends and colleagues so more and more people listen in. To those of you who are joining for the first time, ours is an ongoing series in which we bring business leaders, management gurus, and writers to talk about their new books and share with you their insights and expertise. The book featured today is not just interesting, but also most unusual. I think you'll get that from the title, which says it all. The Serendipity Mindset, the Art and Science of Creating Good Luck. And all this time we thought good luck was just a matter of chance. The author is Dr. Christian Busch, a professor at New York University and the London School of Economics. He will be in conversation with Akash Nahar, Director, Regis and Savoy Capital, and founder, India Impact Collective. As usual, there'll be a Q&A, a question and answer with the participants. And Tata Click will give 5 prizes for the best questions. So keep sending your questions in. Now over to you, Akash and Christian.
Thank you, Anil, for the introduction. And many thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Akash Nahar. It's about 5 p.m. in Bangalore, where I'm sitting, and around 6:30 in the morning in New York, where I'll be joined by Dr. Bush to discuss more about his latest book, The Serendipity Mindset, the Art and Science of Creating Good Luck. To set the scene, the discussion we are getting into would be for about 60 minutes. The first 45 minutes would be pure Q&A, followed by 15 minutes to take questions from the audience. So please make use of the chat box to leave your messages, and we will pick up the question and as many questions as possible at the end of 45 minutes. And to start, I think I have known Dr. Busch, I call him Chris, from my London School of Economics days. And therefore, I take the liberty to ask one of the broadest and most tantalizing questions to share his journey so far, what interested him to study and research more about serendipity, and definitely, yes, what inspired him to write this beautiful book, which I've read a couple of times and I'm holding in my hand currently. So over to you, Chris. Please take us through the journey of this book.
Well, thank you so much, Akash, for the wonderful introduction, and good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you today, and thank you so much, Mr. Darker, for putting together such a wonderful event and for creating this kind of setting and platform for us to exchange those ideas. In fact, one of my last trips before the world closed down was to Bangalore, and then I did an India trip around this, and experienced the resourcefulness in the country firsthand again. And so it's always been a pleasure to interact with you and your teams. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation as well. And Akash, our history at LSE and beyond has been a true pleasure as well. So it's wonderful to be here today and interact with you. And I'm looking forward also to the kind of audience interaction, and hopefully also in real life at some point in the near future again as well. Now, my journey started as a teenager. I used to be this kid who was rebellious. I was thrown out of school. I had to repeat a year. I transferred this lifestyle to my driving style. So I probably held the unofficial world record of how many dustbins you can knock over on your way to school when you're in a car. And then one day I wasn't so lucky anymore. I smashed into 4 parked cars, all cars completely destroyed, including my own. And I will not forget the policeman who came to the scene, who looked at the car and who said, "Oh, wow, he's still alive." So this idea, that I was supposed to be dead, this idea that I was supposed to not be here anymore. And I asked myself all these weird questions, if I would have died, who would have come to my funeral? Who would have actually cared? Was it all worth it? And at that point, I only had depressing answers. And so it put me on this intense search for meaning, trying to figure out what is life all about? Why am I here? And I started reading this wonderful book that I reread recently, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is all about this idea that we can find meaning in the toughest of circumstances by reframing and really looking differently at at situations. And so when reading this book, what I realized is that what I find most meaningful, what gives me most meaning, is connecting ideas, connecting people, and somehow initiating something when doing this. And so I started out as community builder, connecting people, connecting ideas, company builder, social entrepreneur. And then at some point, the inner imposter came out and said, Christian, we're always talking about all this social impact and meaningful change, but do we actually know what we're talking about? We're building the plane while we're flying it. And so that pushed me a little bit more into academia and doing in-depth research around, what makes success and failure happen in individuals' lives, in the lives of companies. How do we really create a purposeful organization and company? And what I found fascinating on this journey of, being an entrepreneur, being a researcher and so on, is that the most inspiring, purpose-driven people around me, they seem to have something in common, which is that they somehow intuitively cultivate serendipity. They see something in the unexpected and then turn that into positive outcomes. And so I got fascinated by this question, what could be a science-based framework for understanding how we can cultivate these unexpected positive outcomes? And then essentially, how can we develop a muscle for this? How can we set ourselves up for this to really live a joyful and meaningful life, especially in a time where there's so much uncertainty and anxiety?
Right. I think that's an interesting journey so far. And as I read the book more, it's reminding me of the experiences which many Indian corporates have had. And somewhere in the book, you mentioned very, very interestingly that how one can study serendipity. Is it an art? Is it a science? So as a layman, if you need to explain how somebody can develop this habit of learning serendipity, because generally it doesn't look easy to learn serendipity, connecting the dots, leveraging the dots, and making a bad situation into a positive situation. So with your experience, how does one convert or inculcate this habit of learning serendipity?
That's a great question, because in a way, usually when we think about luck, a lot of times we think about this kind of blind luck, right? The dumb luck, which is essentially passive. So it's, being born into a loving family or other things that we can't really choose. But actually, serendipity is about smart luck. It's about the luck we create ourselves by seeing something in the unexpected and then connecting the dots. And so to give you an example, right? Imagine, if you have erratic hand movements like I do, you tend to spill coffee a lot of times, right? And so imagine you're in a coffee shop and you spill coffee over someone. And somehow you sense there might be something there. You sense some kind of connection. You don't know what it is, but you just sense there might be something there. Now you have two options, right? Option number one is you say, I'm so sorry, here's a napkin. Then you walk outside and you think, what could have happened had I spoken with this person? And then option number two is you're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I was in my head. And then you start a conversation and that person turns out to become the love of your life or your business partner, your co-founder. And so it's really those moments where our reaction to the unexpected defines a lot of the outcome. But also, so in a way, this is really about making that accident meaningful, right? That's the case in inventions and innovations a lot of times, right? Everything from Viagra to penicillin came about in a way where something didn't go according to plan, but then someone did something with it and made it meaningful. But also then what we can talk about is we can also create more meaningful accidents. We can essentially create more of these dots out there and let people connect them. So to give you an example, I'm a big fan of, in companies, I think we have a great audience today of people who are running companies, who are running teams, who are running groups, but even in families, we can do the same. Where I'm a big fan of the project funeral, or essentially the idea that usually, when something doesn't work out in a company, in an organization, we try to hide it, right? We try to not be responsible for it. And so the problem is we don't really learn from each other a lot, because we try to a lot of times talk about the things that worked well, but not the things that didn't work so well. And so the project funeral is about saying, you know what? But a lot of times actually an idea might not have worked in one context, but it might be great for another context. So in this one example, there was this company that has a window frame, a window glass. And the idea is that the light doesn't reflect. And so, it's a great idea, the light doesn't reflect and so on, but they realized, hey, the market is not big enough, and so we can't really sell enough of those. So the project manager responsible for this would say, oh, okay, let's bury this in front of other project managers from other divisions. We learned that next time we should understand the market better. Now someone in the audience goes like, hey, have you considered what this would mean for solar? Have you considered if we take this technology into a solar context, how amazing the energy absorption could be? And that is how, quote unquote, coincidentally, part of their solar division emerged. It was a positive coincidence. It was lucky that this person was in the audience at exactly that time, that it was exactly that dot connecting happening. But the company facilitated a process that made it more likely that that kind of unexpected positive outcome would happen, and also build trust and other things in the process.
Excellent. So it sounds to me that you're saying that you need to have a certain outlook in life or in a corporate life to have serendipity to happen. For example, I am flying in a flight, and the co-passenger next to me is the CEO of a large IT company. But unless I have a certain outlook and I need to do something in the space of IT, etc., maybe that contact, that connection to me is not that relevant. In that case, how do I join the dots? So maybe I cannot have a conversation beyond 2 minutes with that gentleman. Unlike somebody coming from a financial industry, maybe I can have a chat for maybe half an hour. So how does one create that connection with not so seemingly conventional conversations?
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of times we cannot really know what makes the other person interesting, right? A lot of times, even with people in our own areas, but also more general, because we always ask these kind of same questions, right? We ask something like, so what do you do? And then we put someone in a box and that's that, right? But instead of doing this, we can ask questions such as, what inspires you at the moment when looking at XYZ, or, what is it that you're excited about? Whatever it is, something that opens up that box a little bit into what the person is really all about. And what the interesting thing is, Akash, where it gets really interesting usually is how we respond to questions. If the other person asks us something like, what do you do? Instead of just saying, I'm an IT professional and that's that, we could learn from Ollie Barrett, who's a wonderful entrepreneur in London. If you would ask him that question, he would say something like, well, I'm a technology entrepreneur, but recently started playing the piano, but what I'm really interested in is the philosophy of science. And so what he's doing here is he's casting 3 hooks where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. I recently started hosting piano matinees. We should catch up. Oh my God, such a coincidence. My sister is teaching the philosophy of science. We should talk more. The point is that a lot of times we can't know the potential overlaps, but what we can do is we can seed a couple of dots. We can cast a couple of hooks where we then allow the other person to take the hook that they are most interested in. And I've seen that in particular useful with those people where we don't really intuitively know yet where a conversation could be going, but we can in a way kind of, cast a couple of those hooks. And so I think also to your initial question, right, that in a way, the outlook we have on life, and maybe we can dive deeper into this. I think there's a lot of experiments how the outlook on life, in a way, predefines how lucky we can be. But to your initial question around what you can do in that plane, I'm a big fan of the way we ask questions to change that and the way we answer questions.
Oh, interesting. I think that reminds me of, in fact, one of the co-sponsors of an event, Starbucks, when Mr. Howard used to be the then CEO and also the head of Seattle Supersonic basketball team, and he happened to visit the cafe at Milan, and that's when the serendipity moment, if I can call, happened, where he decided that Starbucks should not be just a bean selling place, but it should be an experiential place. And today, you know what Starbucks is, and Tata's have involvement with serendipity. But coming back to my question, and currently in today's world where most of us are working from home, the number of interactions are reducing. How do we cultivate a habit of, if I can say, a serendipity mindset, being at home, working from home, and still trying to achieve the aspirational things which we want to achieve, especially for the millennials? And as I was discussing with you last time, India is going to be one of the youngest country by 2021. So what would be your suggestion, idea for the social entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, and people who have entered the business field for the first time? It's easy for an established person to have a more meaningful conversation. Maybe for a youngster, it's difficult to pick up those conversations and the other person being interested. So broadly, I would say, how would you advise a young millennial today to make use of his limited network and reach where he or she aspires to be, especially for a country like India.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I feel there's so much potential, and it's an exciting time to be alive, because at the moment there's so many things that we thought were in stone, and now everything is questioned, right? Every assumption has been questioned. And so what that means is that as a young person, there's a lot we can impact at this point in time, especially within large companies and beyond large companies as well. And so I'm actually a big fan of starting with a Serendipity journal and really saying, let's first think about what are the themes I'm most interested in. What are the bigger themes that feel meaningful to me? Is there something, maybe I have a certain North Star that I say within the next 2 years, I would love to, travel XYZ countries and do XYZ things, and then trying to understand how to get there. Or are there particular themes that I find particularly meaningful, and really becoming aware of what those themes are. And then having every conversation, every interaction, trying to seed a little bit of this into the conversation. That can be with a professor, right? Like just seeding this additional sentence of saying, oh, by the way, I've been extremely curious about just in case you hear something, let me know, right? Or with a young professor, kind of just seeding a couple of dots in those conversations we anyways have with our uncles, with our brothers, with our sisters. A lot of times opportunities come from the most unexpected of places, and it's our obligation in a way to let people know what that could be, so that they can actually help us. If people don't know what we're excited about, they can't really help us. Once they know, they can actually help us connect the dots. And I think I've been always throughout my life surprised how many people want to help once they know how they can help. And so if we allow them to help by seeding a couple of things, that is the first step. So I would start with this Serendipity journal and saying, what are the themes I'm really interested in? Is there a North Star? Or if not, are there certain principles or interests that could be interesting? Then second step would be to reflect on what is it, how can I in my life, when I have now an approximate sense of direction, but also know that a lot of the opportunities will come unexpectedly, how do I set myself up for this? And the problem is a lot of times we have self-limiting beliefs, right? A lot of times there's something that holds us back. I mean, imagine that coffee shop situation, and how many times in our lives did we have the situation where we walked out of a meeting or so and said, I should have mentioned this unexpected idea I had, or I should have done this, these kind of moments. And what helps us in the Serendipity journal is to write down in those moments where we saw something in the unexpected, but we didn't act on it, what was holding me back? What was it that held me back? And then really also doing the work to understand, oh, wow, there seems to be an imposter syndrome here. I have to work on this. Or, oh, wow, I don't feel ready. Why do I not feel ready? What can I do to feel ready? And so really kind of to working on the patterns that hold us back from acting on opportunity on one hand, but also then really reflecting more on what are the things in my life where I was happy about how I reacted to the unexpected. What were things where it was really, I was very happy about it, and then how can I do more of this? Because again, it's one thing, I know there's all these people who say these are the 5 steps to become successful, but that's a little bit disingenuous, because these 5 steps can be very different for different people. What's much more realistic is to say hey, I as a person have these interests, these principles, and now I learn how I myself can make this into something that feels authentic to me as a practice. We can also talk about a couple of more practices then, like, I'm a big fan, for example, of Serendipity Bombs, where, you write down who are the 20 most inspiring people. If you work in Tata, for example, there's an abundance of inspiring people, right? Really, and then thinking about who are the key people who are extremely inspiring, who are interested in similar areas, and just reaching out to them. It is surprising how many people, especially at the moment, go back to one if you have an inspiring question or an inspiring thing that you could bring up. And so I'm a big fan of just seeding a couple of dots, not expecting a lot, not expecting a response from everyone, but actually just seeding a couple of those things that might go off at some point.
Right. Very well put. I think it makes sense in today's world. And as I go through the book, I am rather happy that it's not another feel-good book. I think it's firmly based in the science of how people can use serendipity, etc. But I also want to know some interesting experiences you had while interviewing people, or some anecdotes, which I see quite a few in your books. I think you've interviewed more than 50, 60 diverse set of people. So I would be more curious to know from you a couple of very interesting stories where people came out from a very difficult situation and made that positive situation as a negative situation to a big positive. And today it could be a global brand or a global music brand or anything for that matter. So with your interviews, anecdote, etc., if you could just highlight on two such examples, which would inspire the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I assume what's most important probably for the audience is if you're, let's say, in a transition, right? If you're in a career transition at the moment, or if you're in this ambiguity that you don't really know what to do in life at the moment. I'm a big fan of doing something that Michelle Cantos have been doing. So she is a wonderful now social entrepreneur who essentially what she did was to say, you know, she had just quit her job, and she you know, she had used to work in a non-profit company, and you know, she was always in the non-profit sector, and so she was always very excited about this, but now she was longing for doing something different. Now what she did was she wrote down a very short email where she said, hey, I'm currently on a sabbatical, I'm currently exploring new exciting things, if you have any ideas, let me know. She sent that to just like 50 friends or so of hers, not expecting anything, just putting it out there. I'm here. And you know, it's that kind of period where you know how much anxiety there is, right? When you're in this period where you just don't really know what to do next, and you're like, oh my God, what is the meaning of everything, and what could be out there, and so on. And so she had a couple of people then get back to her and say, oh, like that's great and all the best. So more the emotional support messages. But then one person came back and said, you know what? I just went through an application process at a tech company, at a tech incubator, and you know, your skill sets would actually fit perfectly on them. And you know, Michelle had never even considered that she could work in a tech company. You know, that world for her was so different because she thought, I'm a nonprofit person, I'm someone who's supposed to be in this field. But this other person saw something in her that she didn't even see. And so she then said, this friend said, hey, look, I went through the whole application process. I didn't take the job in the end because I had another job that I found even more exciting, but I think you would be perfect. I want to put you in touch. She put them in touch, and you know, she went through the process and got the job. And the point is, this is a completely different field from what she expected, but actually her skill set and what she wants to do in the world was perfect for that position because it was a tech company that also has a societal impact. And so the point here is, what I loved about her story was that she essentially made herself a little bit vulnerable, not to the degree that you would feel any kind of, you know, when you look back and you would be like, oh my God, you cringe that you put something out there that you shouldn't have put out there, but in a way that puts something out there where other people can actually help you in that kind of more vulnerable position, and then essentially can connect the dots for you. And so I really liked how she did that repeatedly actually now in a couple of situations where, especially she coming from a more low income background, that helped her really to accelerate her career. Now, I think there's a lot of examples also, you know, more broadly speaking, of, you know, people who in especially resource constrained environments. I mean, we talked about Jugaad and other ideas, right, when we spoke about India and how resourceful and creative people are, and I think I'm a big fan of a gentleman in South Africa, in the Cape Flats in Cape Town, called Marlon Parker. And so Marlon Parker essentially is a great example of how you can create a lot of serendipity. He grew up in one of the toughest conditions you can imagine, you know, high crime rates, drug abuse, you know, poverty, so the toughest environment you can imagine. And he and a couple of his friends said, you know what, we will not let ourselves be defined by this situation. What we will do is we will work, of course, on the structural constraints. That's important. That's key to really work on structural constraints. But also, let's develop a low-cost education methodology that essentially, you know, it's about 10 steps to 10 steps to use social media to make an impact, or 10 steps to use social media to build a business. And they take that methodology and they go to local communities, and instead of asking, what do you need? They ask, what is already here and how can we make the best out of it? And so by reframing the situation away from resource needs to resourcefulness, essentially that's where people start looking at a former drug dealer and say, great, this person could be a potential teacher, because if we can get them as a teacher, they can turn a community around because they have social capital, they have resourcefulness and so on. When they look at an old garage, they see a training center. They say, wow, like we can do something with this. the point here is that they create serendipity now all the time because they look at a situation and reframe it in a creative way. And that approach has now been used around the world, from banks to big companies to others, to really say, instead of like complaining about resource constraints and about smaller budgets, no, what is it in that budget cut that actually can help us to do something even more creative? And I think I found that very inspiring, because I think if you can do that in the toughest of environments, you can also do that in a lot of other environments.
Also, I think this reminds me of M-Pesa in Africa, the way it was a serendipity moment for people to transfer money, and it was inbuilt. And I think today that's the largest company when it comes to transferring money, be it the smallest amount to the largest amount. And the first example, I think, is easy to replicate. It's just that we need to apply the mind, I guess, and be ready to latch on the opportunity which comes. Coming back to your book, I have highlighted a few things, and I just appreciate if you can talk more about it. So I think you have mentioned very clearly 5 or 6 steps, basic steps, how somebody could come out of the normal and ask more questions which are easy to connect. First one being ask questions differently is what you mentioned in your book. Second is reframe the situation. Then what I like is enable serendipity spotting, which is something new. So I need to know more about that, and maybe the audience would also like to know, how does one spot serendipity? And look at crisis differently. I think everybody is surrounded by crisis currently, or the crisis keep coming every day, every hour. How do you look at crisis differently? And lastly, develop a dual North Star. So I would appreciate if you can talk through the point number 3, which is enable serendipity spotting. And if at all you want to cover any of the other 1 or 2, please feel free to cover that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think what all 3 of those have in common, trying to see something in the unexpected and then turning something unexpected into something positive, but also having that North Star, is that they all rely on a certain ability to see something in a moment. And so to answer the first point, I want to give you a wonderful experiment that I'm a big fan of, which shows the importance of opening our eyes to the world. And it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy where, those people who consider themselves to be lucky tend to be luckier. And so, I'm a big fan. So there's a researcher in the UK who did an experiment. And, I would love to ask everyone in the audience, to ask yourself, do you consider yourself to be lucky? And just, sit with this for a second. I mean, Akash, do you consider yourself to be lucky, or?
No, I definitely consider myself to be one of the luckiest guys, at least so far it's been so good. So yes, I definitely consider myself to be lucky, extremely lucky.
Perfect, because
that's a new thought which I've never thought about. If you feed positivity, positive outcomes do come up, and if you keep feeding negativity, then I think you end up with negativity. So I think yes, that's a valid question, and how we can rephrase the situation and the question as a whole.
Well, and that's so you will see that some companies actually have that question in their application process, right? That they literally ask people, do you consider yourself to be a lucky person? And the reason is that in this experiment that I'm a big fan of, and other experiments, they took essentially a person who self-identifies as very lucky, so someone who says, good things always happen to me, and so on, and then someone who self-considers themselves as to be very unlucky, so someone who says, I'm always in accidents, bad things always happen to me. And then they tell both people, walk down the street, go into a coffee shop, order a coffee, sit down, and then we'll have our coffee.
Right.
Now, what they don't tell them is that there's hidden cameras along the street and inside the coffee shop, that there's a £5 note in front of the coffee shop, and inside the coffee shop, there's only this, next to the counter, there's this chair next to this extremely successful businessman who can make big ideas happen. Now, the lucky person walks down the street, sees the £5 note, picks it up, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, has a nice conversation, they exchange business cards, potentially an opportunity coming out of it. We don't know that part. Now, the unlucky person walks down the street, steps over the £5 note, so doesn't see it, goes inside, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, ignores the businessman, and that's that. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both people, so how was your day today? And so the lucky person says, it was amazing. I found money in the street. I made new friends. And, potential opportunity, we don't know that. Now, the unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And we all know those people in our lives, right, who seem to be a little bit luckier, even though they face exactly the same situation. And that has a lot to do with that idea that when you expect something to happen, it tends to happen more because you open your eyes to it. And that's actually one of the biggest biases we have, that we consistently underestimate the unexpected. I mean, those of you who are interested, there's the birthday paradox I'm a big fan of. So this idea that in a room of 23 people, there's a 50% probability that 2 people have the same birthday. And that is crazy, right? Because usually our usual self would say, if you have 23 people in a room, it's 365 days in the year, you divide that by each other, and you have a very low probability that 2 people have the same birthday. But actually, because it's exponential, because, you know, if you're Akash, you're person number 23, then Mr. Darker is person number 22. Like Akash has 22 people who could have the same birthday. Mr. Darker still has 21 people who could have the same birthday, and so on. So it's an exponential function. The point here is that the unexpected actually is extremely likely, because all these things that are unlikely, right, like me throwing down my laptop now when we're speaking, you shouting at me, Mr. Darker pulling the plug, like all these things are very unlikely in themselves. But if you add it all up, it becomes actually quite likely that something unexpected happens. And so the first point really is around, we consistently underestimate how likely the unexpected is, and so we consistently don't see it. We are not able to spot serendipity. Now, the second thing that you mentioned, and I think that's a really important one, is how do we turn accidents or things that don't necessarily work into something positive? And so, you know, a lot of times the way we get trained is in a way that we say we have to plan everything out, we have to map everything, and if it doesn't go according to plan, it's our weakness. We're a weak leader if we can't do this, right? So you do your marketing plan, and then you assume everything to go exactly to that plan. And if you see customer feedback that's different, you're like, oh, no, like I don't want to see this because our strategy has to work. Now, what that does is, of course, that a lot of times failure becomes much more costly because we only then react much later in the process. Now, I'm a big fan of 2 things. To really then in meetings, for example, from time to time, just ask, what surprised you last week? Was there something in the data that surprised you? And I want you to find that surprises, and that's not a bad thing. It's part of our culture to detect those unexpected things early on, because we want to cultivate that serendipity. Now, at a company in China called Haier, that led to a potato washing machine. You know, so they, you know, it's a company, and I think we talked about some wonderful Indian examples as well, if you want to chat about some of those later. But I think, you know, what fascinated me about that example was, you know, essentially they had farmers who told them, hey, look, your crappy washing machine is always breaking down. So they asked them, why is it breaking down? Well, we're trying to wash our potatoes in the washing machine. And so, you know, in unexpected moments, a weak leader might say something like, oh, like, don't wash the potatoes in the washing machine. We produced it for clothes, so don't wash it, like use it like we wanted you to use it. They did the opposite. They said, well, that's unexpected, but you know, there's a lot of farmers in China who might have a similar problem. So why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potato washing machine? And that's how unexpectedly the potato washing machine emerged, again, based on a practice of essentially saying we want to see something that could be unexpected, and then we want to invest into that as it comes up. And then to your third point, Akash, around the North Star, that's one of the most important ones, right? That really comes back to, so we did a large study with over 40 of the world's leading CEOs. So we sat down with them and we said, what is it that really makes you successful? What is it as the CEO of a MasterCard or Mars or Danone or so that really, really, really makes you successful? And one of the things that turned out to be across those different very interesting leaders was that they're extremely good at having some kind of sense of direction, some kind of sense of where they're going. So Ajay Banga, for example, at MasterCard would be someone who says, look, I want to bring a couple of 100 million people into the financial system who don't have access to that financial system yet, right? So that's kind of like a big North Star idea. But then also there's the openness to the unexpected at the same time, saying, this is the North Star, this is the approximate strategy, but I already tell you now that some of this will be emergent, and that is part of the plan rather than a vulnerability.
So this leads to 2 other questions, I think, related to it. So I think you're saying, in short, that how do we create meaningful accidents, and how do we make accidents more meaningful is what I get to understand. At the same time, is it more easy for a small setup or a small company to make the deviations, take a pivot and get into something new, because a larger company, it might be too difficult for them to pivot at a particular time. They might be just blind to new opportunities. That's number one. Personally, what I've also been wanting to ask is, how big does culture play a role in being open to opportunities? And is it something which can be a different from a global south to a global north? You have traveled across Europe, now you're in New York. I have traveled across Europe, Africa, India. I see there are different personality traits among different people. So for example, if somebody is an introvert, do you think he's doomed for failure? He can't succeed or she can't succeed? And I see that as a big bottleneck for people to start the conversation, to take the idea forward, and also then build meaningful conversation. So broadly, I need to understand, is size a problem, number one? Because I see a lot of new innovative things happening among smaller and mid-sized companies because they're more risk-taking. They're not so much scared of taking failure on the face, and they have nothing beyond a point on the downside. And second, how big does culture play a role in creating this serendipity mindset, specifically in global south and global north, if I can say?
Yeah, yeah, that's great questions. I mean, to the first one in terms of size, it's interesting, right? Because I feel one of the biggest trends we've seen over the last years is a more networked approach to organizations, where large companies say, you know what, we have to be able to leverage the economies of scale. So we have to leverage our size, you know, economies of scale and economies of scope. But at the same time, we also need to be adaptive enough to work like a startup in some ways, because we know that customer trends are shifting. We know that the world is shifting a lot, especially during COVID. We've seen this. And, you know, if you look at COVID, what has happened, you're right, that smaller companies can adjust potentially easier because they're structured in a way that, you know, allows for easy pivoting. I mean, some of the examples at the moment, right? We saw, for example, how breweries who couldn't sell their alcohol anymore to restaurants because they closed down turned into hand sanitizer companies, right? It's very hard to do that as a big company, to have like 100,000 people who now get reorientated towards, you know, becoming hand sanitizer company. It's easier to do that as a small company. But actually what big companies are very good at increasingly, I mean, if you look at companies like Hire, what they've been creating is ecosystems where they have teams of teams that allow to experiment in a low risk way. And I think that's what the 2 points related to size to me are that are absolutely key. The first one is that there needs to be a very clear filter of what kind of serendipity is wanted versus what is just a distraction, right? Like, you don't want people who run around and like see opportunities everywhere, but nothing gets executed. That doesn't help anyone. So it's really about saying the most effective filter is, like in the example of Ajay Banga at MasterCard, the idea that you say there is a certain North Star, and I want you to connect unexpected dots to this North Star. If you can't connect it to the North Star, put it on a parking lot, write it down, but we don't talk about it now. And so it's really like a clear filter in that, but also then internally having, you know, flash evaluations or brain trusts, like Pixar, for example, the very creative company that produces these kind of movies like Finding Nemo. They have a brain trust where whenever you have like exciting ideas emerge, essentially then there's an informal conversation among a couple of people who say, this idea could work at the moment, this not so much. But these people are among the creatives, but relate that always back to the North Star. And so I think the idea of filter is extremely important, because otherwise you get distracted. Then the second, of course, is really around the idea of structure. Like, how do we have the structure happen that allows us to, you know, de-risk those kind of ideas in a way that we don't bet our whole company on something when we see something new emerging. And I think that's where Hire, for example, has been very good to say, when we have these teams of teams, we can allow for some experimentation around new products and new services, as long as we can also kind of hedge our bets around this and place bets on this. And so it's almost like that big companies then become almost like investors into good ideas, right? You develop an ecosystem where you invest into the best ideas. I think we can dive more into this, but I think those two things, the filters and then a kind of a network structure that allows for those kind of experimentations being important, but then also, to your point, developing a culture that actually in a way, you know, works on this resistance to change mindset, right? Because it's one thing to be resistant to change because it might risk the future of the company. So that's the good kind of fear, right? And then there's the bad fear, which is about politics, which is about people not wanting to be reallocated to other jobs and so on. And that's really about then leadership in a way, making very clear what are exactly the changes and how is that more of an opportunity and how is not changing actually riskier than changing. In terms of the second one, and I think that's a really interesting one, the culture and the personality traits piece. I grew up in Germany, and in Germany, we grew up with this. I want to have a plan. I want to know exactly what works. And then you go out into the world and you realize, oh my God, the world is much more like a squiggle, right, than like a straight line. And then you have, I love what I've loved about India especially is, right, the kind of resourcefulness, creativity, where people kind of live and create as a lot of times as you go along. And so I think it's kind of like those like different, if you have a continuum, like different types of approaches to life and to how you create. And I feel as usual, what effective companies are doing is to find a good middle way in terms of saying, here's a North Star, that's where we're going, and here's the kind of creativity and resourcefulness. But what that means for individuals is, you talked about introverts versus extroverts. I've been fascinated by that question because, I'm a closet introvert. Like, I'm the kind of person who seems extremely extroverted, right? I have no problem giving a speech or something. And then I'm like, wow, I need 2 days now to recover because like I have this spike of extroversion, but now I need time to recover. And so I've been very interested actually in how can introverts navigate uncertainty in a way and navigate serendipity that doesn't necessarily cost them so much energy. And so, for example, I'm a big fan of when going to a party or an event or so or a conference to try to talk with the host first, because the host is the person who will meet the most people. And so if I can inject a good idea into the host will work around and walk around with that idea and in a way talk about it for me. And so I'm a big fan of thinking about how can one leverage extroverts to essentially then not have to be extrovert oneself all the time. But as you saw in the example of the lucky versus unlucky person, we talked about this, the person who starts the conversation with the businessman. That is something, right, where extroversion can help us because we can have potentially more conversations and things. But actually, at the same time, the introvert is the one who a lot of time reflects deeper. The introvert might also be the one who has an open mind, seeing the 5-pound note. So a lot of times, actually, serendipity comes from quiet sources, like books or movies or other things. So there's a lot of hope for introverts too.
Oh, interesting. And I think before I conclude this and we get into the questions, I think in the second book, you definitely need to cover the story of Titan, which is a Tata Group company, how it started as a idea, and then it was almost going to be shut. And today you'll be surprised, it's a $10 billion company, the second most valuable company in the Tata Group stable. So maybe in the second book we'll cover Harish Bhatt and Bhaskar Bhatt, who set up Titan, and today it's one of the big babies in the Tata Group. So I think thank you so much for these inputs. And maybe before I conclude, I'll take a couple of key takeaways for large families and also read out the questions, which are the top 6 questions for the day. So the first question comes from Ashish Gupta. And the question is, we equate serendipity with curiosity. Would that increase your chance of good luck?
I love that question. Thank you so much, Ashish. I actually, I don't know if you can see it here. It's somewhere here. But so one of my favorite books actually is The Little Prince. And The Little Prince is about this boy, right, who explores the world and different planets and the universe and everything, and always just asks questions, right? Asks all these questions. He asks why all the time. Right. And so actually, we've seen curiosity to be one of the key parameters because it allows to consistently question things. It allows to consistently see something new in a situation. And so what we actually, for example, found in that study that we did with those CEOs is that they all somehow in some way are practical philosophers. They're consistently questioning everything. And by doing this, that allows them to continuously innovate. And so curiosity is definitely at the core of a lot of serendipity. And so thank you so much, Ashish, for asking that.
You are reminding of my 12-year-old niece who keeps asking me questions upon questions. Some days I get tired, but yes, I love the curiosity. The second question is by J. Menon. And the question is like this: creating luck by conversation sounds good for outgoing people. Does this mean that introverts are less likely to create their luck? I think we touched upon this topic about how introverts can also be successful. If you would like to add to that, please go ahead. This question is by one Mr. Menon.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And that's a great question, because I think it's really, a lot of times introverts have two roles, right? The first role of the introverts, especially in teams, is that when you have a team that has a couple of extroverts who go out there, who pitch ideas and everything else, a lot of times they benefit from having introverts around who help them ground the ideas, who help them ground and talk through different types of topics. And so there's a lot of benefit actually of introverts for extroverts. And you will see love couples, for example, a lot of times it is actually the opposites attract type dynamic, right? Where the introvert can help the extrovert a lot. But then also for introverts, one of the things I found really interesting about serendipity is how long incubation time is, right? So, we all know this moment in the shower on Sunday when like you have this eureka idea, right? This aha, oh my God, this is the great idea or something. But this a lot of times take a lot of time, right? Your brain was working on something for a long time. You read about different things, and then at some point it happened. And because serendipity is not just about this moment when you meet someone and do something, but actually a lot of times about connecting dots from so many different areas, actually introverts can do a lot around this. I met a person, for example, recently who had an idea for a new project by going into an old bookstore, looking at an old book and saying, oh, wow, people haven't talked about this issue for 200 years. I should do a company that actually focuses on this. And so that came from a kind of very calm, silent source rather than from an interaction with people. And so I think it's really important to see that interactions with people are very important a lot of times, but actually interactions with, taking another route to when going to work and like looking at the windows and then making some kind of connection with something we see and so on, or seeing that kind of note in the street, that money in the street and things, that's really something that every introvert can do as well. So I think there's a lot for that, but also there's a lot of strategies for introverts to push a little bit out of the comfort zone, which also can be important, right? And let's say you anyways have those conversations, right? You anyways have to have a conversation with your boss from time to time. Why not building in a little bit of this kind of extra information so that the boss actually can then say, oh my God, I didn't even know you work on XYZ. I can promote you to do something different that could be this and this. And I actually, you will be surprised how often, so I was working with an insurance company a few days ago where the boss, essentially the COO, he literally said, look, when I have performance reviews and people tell me unexpectedly about other things that could also be interesting to me, a lot of times actually they get relocated to really interesting things that they didn't even know how I could actually create a position for them. And so it's really about floating a little bit also these different things in conversations we anyways have.
Perfect. I think I should take my masala cup tea and go visit the old bookstores to get some ideas now. Running out of ideas. The next question is by one Mr. Rani, and she asked Dr. Busch, how do you define success? Is it not meant to do more with hard work rather than having serendipity? That's an interesting question. So how do you differentiate between hard work and having more of serendipity?
Yeah, it's interesting, and maybe starting with the second one, because I think there's a lot of times exactly that conversation, right? And thank you so much for the wonderful questions. There's a lot of times this kind of conversation, right? That when people look back on their lives and they talk about what made them successful, they talk about, oh, I worked really hard and then I had a little bit of luck, right? So they separate those two, right? But actually what is happening when you really look at their stories is they worked very hard to have more luck. They worked very hard to have luck happen more often. And so when you look back at kind of examples of serendipity in people's lives, a lot of times, there was this kind of maybe an initial kind of luck of the draw, right? You're born into a good family or something like this. So you have a certain starting level that might be higher or lower than others, right? And I think that's extremely important to take into account, that some people have different starting positions than others, and we have to work on leveling the playing field. But then actually on that journey of what they do, of what they work, by developing this muscle that allows them to act on the unexpected, actually that makes them have more luck then. And so it's almost like going to the gym and working out. When you work out that kind of serendipity muscle, you have to work hard for this. Serendipity doesn't just happen to you. Luck just doesn't happen to you. You have to work hard to have that luck. And so I think that is what actually fascinates me most about this this work and this idea of the serendipity mindset, that it is about working really hard to be lucky. And so really kind of putting that into that. And I think that also brings us to the idea of success, right? Because what is success in the end? I mean, I found that fascinating, when thinking about what is actually a positive outcome of something, right? Because I've had a lot of conversations with people who, after I had my near-death experience, for example, I've had conversations with people who face death. And what's interesting when you face death, of course, is you look back on life and you think about what was really meaningful to me. And, very few people look back and say, I wished I had had 6 cars in my garage rather than 5 cars, right? Like, yeah, not that meaningful. But actually they look back and say, oh, wow, what was these kind of key moments in my life that were really important? And that's why I'm such a big fan of doing that serendipity journal, because it's really also about clarifying what are the values, what are the principles that I want to live by, that when I will look back in 80 years from now, or 60 years from now, or 30 years from now, whenever that happens, that we will be on the deathbed, that then, or on the nursing bed, that then we can say, wow, I lived a life true to my values. Because one of the biggest regrets that people have on their deathbeds is essentially that they say, I didn't live life true to my values. I didn't live the life that I could have lived and really build the meaningful relationships that I wanted to build. And so I think, to me, success increasingly means, what is that kind of thing when I look back in XYZ years on my deathbed that would feel regretful if I hadn't done it? And then how can I build this in now? And that would success mean. That doesn't mean, some people might define that materialistically, but I think it is bigger than that. I think it is much bigger than just thinking about how much money on the bank account. I think the real important thing is what feels really meaningful and how to do this now, because we might run in front of a car every day, right? And so just postponing what feels meaningful to when we're 70, that might be too late.
Interesting, and it definitely adds to what, how we define success. The next question I think is very interesting, by one Mr. Karan Kharas. The question is like this: to take your opening example, should I create opportunities by deliberately spilling coffee on my neighbor every time I go to Starbucks?
That's a great question. I actually had that conversation with Yeah, no, that's a great question. I actually had that conversation with my partner, because I was like, look, because she asked me exactly that question, Christian, like, we want to work on your erratic hand movements. And I was like, well, but if I don't have erratic hand movements anymore, I won't spill coffee anymore. So where's my serendipity then? And so we had exactly that conversation. But jokes aside, like, I think the interesting thing really is to think about, in the coffee spilling example, that's one of the examples where, I wouldn't necessarily build that in as a practice. But I think it is those kind of moments, right, where you, in a way, you're setting hooks, right, in some way or the other. And I think, there's a lot of other examples, I think, how we can do that in a kind of safer way than spilling coffee. But I love the question, because I think it leads to the key thing that we talked about earlier. How can we, when we reflect on the moments in our lives where we acted on things that were unexpected in some way, what is it, how we can do more of this in our own lives? Is it when, I don't know, if we're dropping a lot in the supermarket, right? What is then like the one sentence we can say if someone says something, or like, what are the kind of simple things we can do that, in a way, if we have repeatedly things in our lives that go wrong or something, what is a comeback? So to give you an example, a friend of mine, she used to blush a lot when she gives presentations, right? And she always felt very constrained by this. And then we went through this exercise, and then she said, well, you know what, now she makes an opening joke where she says, my God, I'm so excited to be here. You can see I'm getting even so red. And so she owned that. And so by working on how she reacted to that moment that theoretically is unexpected, but actually at some point you see the pattern, and learning a practice of how to respond to that, she brought people on her side by doing this. And so it's really, in a way, those things that, are unexpected, we can make them feel more expected once we look out for them. And I've done that, for example, with presentations, right? At the moment, a lot of times a Zoom connection might break or something, and I then have 1 or 2 sentences that I can fill in as a response to that unexpected moment of a connection breaking down or something. And that's just kind of preparing our muscle for the unexpected, for those kind of situations that happen much more often, even if they are in the moment unexpected.
Sounds interesting. And I think it's close to spilling the beans. And the last question for the day is from Sharon Dias. The question is, how do you create good luck in a toxic office environment? I think it's a pretty normal question and which most of us face on a day in and day out, irrespective whether it's a good office, bad office, large MNC, small SME. The environment sometimes might not be something which you would like to. So how does one come out of that situation?
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me of this. I don't know if anyone watched on Netflix the show Suits, but there's this show where you have two lawyers who are high powered. So you have
Yes.
Louis Litt and then Spectre, the main protagonist, and Harvey Specter, the main protagonist, and Louis Litt, those two people, when they are always kind of in a bit of a toxic kind of like stabbing each other in the back type setting and so on so. But whenever it comes to fighting for Mike, who's a close friend of theirs, then they work together and they work so good together. There's no better team in the world than that. And so that really leads us to the question, right? How do we create those micro moments of people feeling they're in it together, right? Be it for fighting for a person. You will see that, right? When people who are divorced, for example, and their child is in the hospital, like that's when you come together. Like that's when you're like, wow, shoot, we have to work on this together. And so creating those micro moments that give us a joint purpose, a joint meaning, can be very effective. And like thinking proactively about this. I'm also a big fan of trying to create psychological safety in the sense of, if I'm running a team, for example, what are small ways that I can bring in a little bit more psychological safety? Those of you interested, Amy Edmondson has been doing amazing work around small things, right? How can you essentially make people part of a conversation where they feel a little bit safer? Highly recommend her work. But third, and most importantly, I think what it really drills down to is, how can one kind of, in a way, when there's a toxic culture across an organization, for example, a lot of times what we've seen in our work is then it's about like separating particular teams and trying to rebuild teams that in a way in themselves are less toxic. And then once you have the first teams, like you can hire new people and build around this. And so I think it's really, in a way, it depends on where in the hierarchy you are, what you can do about toxicity. But I think in general, it comes a lot back to psychological safety, somehow creating a joint purpose on the micro level, and in a way, thinking about how to reallocate teams in ways that they can micro tackle those tensions. But I don't think anyone has an exact, being honest, like this is one of the questions where I don't think there's a golden or silver bullet. I think a lot of companies suffer from this. And I think it also depends on the local context a lot on how to go about it exactly.
I think we couldn't have got a better example than the Suits. And what better way to end these question answer sessions with an example of Suits. I think family comes first, though there might be differences internally, but when it comes for the larger good, I think everybody pitches in and works together towards a common good. So thank you so much. It's been a delight, and we look forward to seeing you sometime in India. And before I hand it over to Anil, I would use all my network, connect all my dots to get in touch with his hairstylist, because I'm in envy with his beautiful hairstyle and I want to have something similar. So over to you, Anil.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Christian Busch and Akash Nahar, for being a part of Tata Literature Live Business Shastras today. I just wanted to ask you, Christian, do you at all believe that real luck, as opposed to the luck you create with what you've been talking about, which also needs a lot of taking opportunities or making opportunities and also a bit of work. But does real work not come into people's success? I mean, things just happen to them.
It's interesting, Mr. Recker, because I had a conversation recently. I'm a big fan of when you think about energy, right? And the question of how essentially, one of the pleasures of writing this book was to think about what do spirituality and molecular chemistry and management have in common. And what they all have in common is that there's some idea that the more you put out in the universe, right, the more interactions there are, the more kind these interactions are, or in molecular chemistry, the more interactions you accelerate, the more there is the possibility of positive unexpected reaction. And so that is in a way what spirituality has taught us for a long time, that the good things that you put out come back to you, and that's what other fields tell us as well. And so I think it's this kind of moment where a lot of this we can't 100% control, but we know a couple of things that help us to have more of this. And I think one of the things actually why I've been connecting so much with Akash and his wonderful India Impact Collective also was because it's a group of people who are saying, wow, yes, some things in life we can't control, and some luck is blind out there, but a lot of luck actually we can also be part of creating by essentially developing a certain mindset, developing a culture, developing a quote unquote energy that somehow helps, and really going through with this. But I would also love, Mr. Darker, in your case, I mean, you've created so much positive things in the world. Do you consider yourself to have been on a lucky streak?
That's a good question, yeah.
Well, I do believe that someone's looking after me because, and this element of spirituality that you're talking about, I do believe there's something of that, and there are people who work very hard and they just don't succeed, and you feel bad for them because they're trying hard, but nothing seems to go right for them. Whereas some people, they try something and it just works. They try anything, it works. So I think, well, in Hinduism, you would call that destiny, I suppose. But nevertheless, also if you believe in spirituality and if you believe in, let's say, astrology, for example, and you have a good period according to the planetary positions and your birth chart. Now, what you do in that good period is really up to you. You could reach a level which is here, or you could reach a level that's there, right? So then your own work comes in, and that's where you make your own destiny as well. So you can't just leave it to destiny and fate for things to happen. These are very interesting questions, and I think we should have another session and talk about them. But in the meantime, let me thank both of you for a very, very interesting hour, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.
And as Akash said, let's hope to see you in India soon.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Anil. And
thank you.
Look for the session. Yes. Take care.
Thank you so much. Great to meet you, and see you soon, I hope. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah.